He had been working at the same office for 3 years. Same desk, same coffee machine, same route to work every single day. Life had become predictable. Wake up at 7, shower, grab breakfast, catch the train, arrive at the office by 9. Day in, day out. Nothing exciting, nothing surprising, just comfortable routine. At 32 years old, he thought this was what adult life was supposed to look like. Stable job, decent salary, bills paid on time. His friends told him he had it all figured out. His parents were proud, but late at night, staring at the ceiling, he sometimes wondered if this was really all there was to life. That Tuesday morning felt exactly like every other Tuesday morning. The alarm went off at 7. He hit snooze once, then dragged himself out of bed. The coffee tasted the same as always. The train was crowded as usual. He scrolled through his phone without really reading anything, just passing time like everyone else around him. His boss had sent an email the week before about some conference, something about sustainable building design and urban planning. Attendance was mandatory for the whole team. He had groaned when he read it. Another boring day of sitting in uncomfortable chairs, listening to speakers drone on about statistics and charts. But he had no choice. Tuesday was conference day. The hotel was downtown, one of those big fancy places with marble floors and chandeliers in the lobby. He arrived with his colleagues, all of them looking equally unenthusiastic. They grabbed their name tags and conference folders, made jokes about sneaking out early, and headed toward the ballroom. The room was massive. Rows and rows of chairs facing a stage with a giant screen. People everywhere, networking, shaking hands, exchanging business cards. The air buzzed with conversations about projects and deadlines and budget proposals. He found a seat near the back, far enough to zone out without being noticed, close enough to look like he was paying attention. He pulled out his phone, planning to quietly check messages throughout the day. Maybe catch up on some news, scroll through social media, anything to make the time pass faster. The opening speaker was already talking about something technical. He barely listened. Then the double doors at the back of the room opened. He glanced up, barely interested, just another person arriving late. But something made him look twice. She walked in with a quiet confidence that immediately caught his attention. Not loud or showy, just present in a way that felt different from everyone else in the room. She moved through the crowd with purpose, her steps measured and deliberate. There was something about the way she carried herself that made people naturally step aside. He found himself staring, unable to look away. She wore a simple professional outfit, nothing fancy, but somehow she stood out. Maybe it was the way she moved, or the focused expression on her face, or something else he couldn't quite name. All he knew was that in that moment, the boring conference suddenly became the most interesting place he'd ever been. She was walking in his direction. His heart started beating faster. Ridiculous, he thought. He was a grown man, not some teenager with a crush. But he couldn't help it. As she got closer, weaving between the rows of chairs, he found himself sitting up straighter, suddenly very aware of his posture, his clothes, his hair. Their eyes met for just a second. Maybe less than a second, but in that brief moment something shifted. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but it felt like the world had tilted slightly on its axis. She moved past his row, then doubled back, 3 seats away from him. She sat down, set her leather bag on the floor, pulled out a notebook and pen. Professional, focused, completely unaware that she had just turned his entire day upside down. He tried to focus on the presentation. The speaker was talking about green spaces in cities, about community planning, about sustainability metrics. Important stuff, probably. But he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting to the woman 3 seats away. She was taking notes, her handwriting neat and precise. When something interesting came up on the screen, she leaned forward slightly. When the speaker made a joke, she smiled, just a small curve of her lips. He noticed everything. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way she nodded when she agreed with something. The way she seemed completely absorbed in the content, genuinely interested in a conference that everyone else was barely tolerating. He wondered who she was, what she did for a living, where she was from, whether she was here alone or with colleagues, whether she had noticed him at all or if he was just another face in a crowded room. The morning session dragged on forever. Normally, he would have been counting the minutes until the break. But now he was nervous about the break. What would he do? Should he try to talk to her? What would he even say? His palms felt sweaty. His mind raced through possible scenarios, each one more awkward than the last. When the speaker finally announced a 15-minute coffee break, people immediately stood up and headed for the refreshment tables. He watched as she gathered her things and walked toward the coffee station. This was it. His chance. Maybe his only chance. He stood up, his legs feeling oddly unsteady. He moved toward the refreshment area, trying to look casual, trying not to look like he was following her. His heart pounded in his chest. What was wrong with him? He'd talked to plenty of people in his life. This shouldn't be difficult, but somehow it was different. This felt different. She stood at the coffee table, adding cream to her cup. He positioned himself nearby, pretending to examine the pastries. His mind went blank. Every opening line he'd thought of suddenly seemed stupid. Just say something, he told himself. Anything. Don't overthink it. He took a breath and turned toward her. His mouth felt dry. He reached for a cup, poured himself coffee he didn't really want, and cleared his throat softly. She was right there, less than 2 feet away. This was the moment. Say something. Say anything. First time at this conference? The words came out before he could second-guess them again. She turned to look at him, and up close she was even more striking. Her eyes were warm and intelligent, and when she smiled he felt his nervousness ease just slightly. Actually, no, she said, her voice clear and friendly. I've presented here twice before. You? They introduced themselves. Her name was Elena. She worked as an urban planner, specializing in creating green spaces in crowded cities. As they talked, he learned she had lived in 3 different countries growing up. Her father had been a diplomat, so her childhood was spent moving from place to place, learning new languages. Adapting to new cultures must have been hard, he said. Always being the new kid, she shrugged, adding sugar to her coffee. Sometimes, but it taught me to adapt quickly, to find home in people rather than places. He told her about his own background, growing up in the same small town his whole life until college. How he'd dreamed of becoming an architect who would change city skylines but somehow ended up in a comfortable office job, designing parking garages and shopping centers. Why, somehow? She asked, her head tilted slightly. What stopped you from doing what you really wanted? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that so directly. I guess. I don't know. Life happened. Bills to pay. Responsibilities. The safe choice seemed smarter. Safe isn't always smart, she said, but not in a judgmental way. More like she was sharing something she'd learned herself. Sometimes safe is just safe. They talked through the entire 15-minute break, then through the next presentation. Neither of them noticed they'd missed the speaker's introduction until someone nearby shushed them gently. They exchanged guilty looks and moved their conversation to the hallway outside. Standing there away from the conference noise, they talked for another 40 minutes. About work, about life, about dreams they'd put on hold. She told him about her project in Copenhagen, designing a neighborhood park that brought together immigrants from 12 different countries. He told her about a design he'd sketched once for a community center but never pitched because it seemed too ambitious, too risky. Do you still have the sketches? She asked, somewhere, probably buried in a drawer at home. You should find them, she said, and the way she looked at him made it feel less like a suggestion and more like a challenge. When they finally checked the time, they'd missed 2 entire presentations. His colleagues would probably wonder where he'd disappeared to, but he didn't care. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that felt this easy, this real. I should probably get back in there, she said, glancing toward the ballroom doors. I know some of the afternoon speakers. Would be rude to miss them completely. He nodded, feeling a slight panic rising. Was this it? Would they just shake hands and never see each other again? Maybe, he started, then stopped. Be brave, he told himself. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime? Actually talk instead of pretending to listen to presentations? She smiled. That same warm smile that had made him nervous and comfortable all at once. I'd like that. They exchanged phone numbers right there in the hallway. He typed her contact information into his phone with fingers that trembled slightly. When she walked back into the conference room, he stood there for a moment staring at her name on his screen, trying to process what had just happened. Over the next 3 weeks, they texted every day. Good morning messages turned into long conversations that stretched late into the night. They met for coffee twice, each time talking for hours until the cafe staff started stacking chairs around them. The first dinner happened on a Friday evening at a small Italian restaurant she recommended. He learned more about her with each conversation. She'd been engaged once years ago to someone she met in graduate school. But the relationship fell apart when she got a job offer in another country, and he refused to even consider moving. She'd chosen her career, and part of her still wondered if she'd made the right choice. "Do you regret it?" he asked over pasta and wine. "Not regret exactly," she said, twirling linguine on her fork, "but it made me careful, made me put up walls. It's easier to focus on work, on projects with clear endings than to risk getting hurt again." He understood more than she knew, because he had his own walls, his own careful life. He'd been with his girlfriend for 4 years. They lived together in a decent apartment, split the bills, had a routine that worked. On paper, everything looked perfect. But talking to Elena made him realize how much he'd been settling. How many conversations with his girlfriend felt surface level. How rarely they talked about dreams or fears or anything deeper than what to have for dinner. How he couldn't remember the last time his heart had raced the way it did every time his phone lit up with Elena's name. The guilt started small. Just a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that he was doing something wrong. Not physically, not technically, but emotionally he was already somewhere else. Every time he came home from meeting Elena, his girlfriend would ask how his day was and he'd give vague answers. "Fine, just work stuff." Boring meeting. The lies felt heavy. Not big lies, just omissions. Not mentioning who he'd had coffee with. Deleting text messages so they wouldn't accidentally pop up on his phone screen. Coming home later than necessary because he didn't want the evening to end. One night, after a particularly long phone conversation with Elena that stretched past midnight, he came to bed to find his girlfriend awake. Sitting up, arms crossed. "Who is she?" she asked. Not angry. Just tired. Like she'd been waiting for this conversation for a while. His stomach dropped. "What do you mean? Please don't insult me by pretending. You've been different for weeks, distracted, always on your phone. Coming home late. I'm not stupid." He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of everything crashing down. She deserved the truth. She deserved honesty, even if it hurt. "Her name is Elena," he said quietly. "I met her at a conference. Nothing physical has happened. But you have feelings for her," she finished for him. He nodded, unable to look at her. The conversation that followed was one of the hardest of his life. Tears from both of them. Accusations and apologies, hurt feelings and harsh truths. But underneath all the pain was something else. A mutual recognition that their relationship had been dying slowly for a long time. They'd both felt it, but neither had wanted to admit it. "I think we stayed together because it was easy," she said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not because we were happy. We were just comfortable. I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. Sorry for hurting her. Sorry for not being honest sooner. Sorry that comfort had become their entire relationship. She moved out 2 weeks later. They divided their belongings with surprisingly little drama. The apartment felt empty after she left, but also lighter somehow, like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. 2 months had passed since the breakup. 2 months of living on his friend's couch while he looked for his own place. 2 months of guilt and second-guessing and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. 2 months of texting Elena every day but not really moving forward because he needed time to process everything that had happened. Now he stood outside her apartment building, his heart pounding the same way it had that first day at the conference. This would be their first real date since he'd become single. No more complicated feelings. No more guilt. Just him and her and the possibility of something real. He knocked on her door, his palms sweaty despite the cool evening air. She opened it with a smile that immediately calmed his nerves. "Come in, I hope you're hungry." Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with plants and books and photographs from her travels. She'd cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with homemade sauce, salad, and wine. But the gesture felt significant. Personal. Like she was inviting him into her private world. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. But underneath the easy comfort, he sensed something else. A nervousness from her that he hadn't seen before. After dinner, they moved to her small living room. She poured more wine, then sat on the opposite end of the couch, putting distance between them. "I need to tell you something," she said, not looking at him. His stomach tightened. Here it comes, he thought. She's going to say this was a mistake. That she can't do this. I'm scared, she continued, her fingers wrapped tightly around her wine glass. I don't do this. I don't let people get close. My whole life I've moved from place to place, never staying long enough to build real roots. It's been easier that way. Safer. She finally looked at him and he could see the vulnerability in her eyes. But you make me want to stay, and that terrifies me because what if I stay and it doesn't work out? What if I give up opportunities because of feelings that might not last? What if, Elena, he interrupted gently, I left a 4-year relationship, moved out of my apartment, completely turned my life upside down, and it wasn't because of some casual attraction. You think you're the only one who's scared? She gave a small laugh, wiping at her eyes. When you put it that way, I'm terrified, he admitted. Every day I wonder if I did the right thing, if I hurt someone for no reason, if this thing between us is real or just some fantasy I built up in my head. But even with all that fear, I can't imagine not trying, not seeing where this goes. She moved closer on the couch, setting down her wine glass. What if I have to move for work? My job, it requires flexibility. I might get assigned to another city. Then we figure it out, he said, together. I'm not asking you to give up your career. I'm just asking you to give us a real chance. That night marked a turning point. They talked until 3 a.m. about their fears and hopes and what they wanted from life. No more holding back. No more protecting themselves with walls and careful distance. The next 6 months weren't perfect. They had their first real fight about 3 weeks in, when she pulled away emotionally after they'd gotten particularly close. She'd panicked, retreated into herself, stopped answering his texts as quickly. It took a long, honest conversation for her to admit she was scared of how much she was starting to need him. That's not weakness, he told her. That's just what caring about someone feels like. He had his own moments of doubt, too. Sometimes late at night he'd think about his ex-girlfriend, about the comfortable life they'd had and wonder if he'd given up something good for something uncertain. But then he'd see Elena, really see her, the way she challenged him and supported him and made him want to be better, and he knew he'd made the right choice. They learned each other's patterns. He learned that when she was stressed about work, she needed space before she could talk about it. She learned that when he got quiet, it meant he was processing something and needed gentle encouragement to open up. They learned to fight fair, to apologize when they were wrong, to admit when they were scared. 5 months in, he found his old sketches. The community center design he'd abandoned years ago. He showed them to Elena one evening, expecting her to politely say they were nice. Instead, she studied them carefully, asking questions about his design choices, pointing out details he'd forgotten he'd included. These are really good, she said. Why didn't you ever pitch this? Didn't seem practical. Too expensive. Too ambitious, so make it practical, she challenged. Adapt it. Scale it down if needed, but don't abandon it just because it's hard. Her words stuck with him. The next week, he started working on a revised version. He pitched it to his boss, expecting rejection. Instead, his boss surprised him by asking for a full proposal. Maybe you're rubbing off on me, he told Elena later. Making me braver. You were always brave, she said. You just needed someone to remind you. 8 months after the conference, they were having dinner at a restaurant downtown when Elena got a call from her supervisor. A major project in Seattle, 6 months minimum, possibly longer. They wanted her to lead it. It was the kind of opportunity she'd always jumped at before. She stepped outside to take the call. He sat alone at the table, his food growing cold, knowing what this meant. This was the test. Would she go? Would she ask him to come with her? Would this be the end? When she came back to the table, her face was unreadable. They want me in Seattle next month, she said. His heart sank. That's great. Big opportunity. I turned it down. He stared at her. What, why? Because I'm tired of running, she said simply. Because I found something here worth staying for. Because for the first time in my life, I want to build roots instead of being ready to leave at any moment. Elena, I can't let you give up your career you're not letting me do anything, she interrupted. This is my choice, and there are opportunities here too. Good ones. I don't have to keep running to prove I'm successful. He reached across the table and took her hand. No words needed. Just understanding and gratitude and relief. A year after the conference, things had settled into a new kind of rhythm. Not the boring, predictable rhythm of his old life, but something better, something chosen rather than defaulted into. He'd gotten his own apartment, a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood he actually liked. Elena hadn't officially moved in, but her toothbrush was in his bathroom, her clothes mixed with his in the closet, her books on his shelves. They hadn't discussed it formally. It just happened gradually, naturally. His community center project had been approved, though in a scaled-down version. But still, seeing his design actually being built, walking past the construction site and knowing he'd created something meaningful, felt incredible. Elena had been right. He just needed to be brave enough to try. Elena had taken a permanent position with the city planning department. No more temporary contracts, no more being ready to pack up and leave. She was building a career here, putting down roots. Sometimes he'd catch her looking slightly panicked about it, and he'd remind her that roots weren't chains. They were just choosing to grow in one place. They had established their own traditions. Sunday morning breakfast at the cafe where they'd had their first coffee. Wednesday evening walks through the park near his apartment. Late-night conversations on his couch, her feet in his lap, both of them sharing details of their days. But they also maintained their independence. She had her own friends, her own interests. He had his. They didn't need to spend every moment together to feel connected. In fact, the time apart made the time together feel even more valuable. His ex-girlfriend reached out once, about 6 months after their breakup. A simple text, "I hope you're happy. I really mean that." He showed it to Elena, not hiding anything. They'd promised each other complete honesty even when it was uncomfortable. "Are you?" Elena asked. "Happy?" He thought about it seriously. Was he happy? His life was more complicated now, more uncertain. He'd given up comfort and predictability. But yeah, he was happy. "Really happy, I am," he said. "Are you?" She kissed him instead of answering, which was answer enough. One evening they were cooking dinner together in his small kitchen. She was chopping vegetables while he stirred sauce on the stove. The radio played softly in the background. It was completely ordinary, completely domestic, and completely perfect. "I've been thinking," she said casually, "about what you asked me months ago." "I've asked you a lot of things over the months," he said, tasting the sauce. "About what we're building. What this is." He set down the spoon and turned to face her. This sounded serious. "I used to think committing to someone meant giving up parts of myself," she continued, still focused on chopping. "That staying in one place meant settling. That putting down roots meant being trapped. And now I think I had it backwards. Running from place to place, never staying long enough to build anything real. That was the trap. This feels like freedom." He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm not scared anymore. Or maybe I'm still scared, but I don't care. I want to build a life with you. A real one. Not perfect, not always easy, but real." They finished cooking dinner, ate while discussing plans for the future. Not vague someday plans, but actual concrete plans. Maybe looking for a bigger place together. Maybe taking a trip to visit her family overseas. Maybe eventually talking about bigger commitments. Everything felt possible. Not guaranteed, not certain, but possible. And that was enough. 18 months after the conference, he stood in the small park near his apartment, the one Elena had helped redesign as part of her work with the city. It was early evening, that perfect golden hour when the light made everything look magical. He'd asked her to meet him here, told her he wanted to show her something for the project. She'd been curious but hadn't pushed for details. That was one of the things he loved about her. She knew when to ask questions and when to just trust him. He heard her footsteps on the path before he saw her. When she came into view, walking toward him with that same purposeful grace she'd had the first day, his heart still raced. Even now, after all these months, after hundreds of conversations and lazy Sunday mornings and late-night talks, watching her approach still made him feel like that nervous guy at the conference. "So what's this mysterious thing you need to show me?" she asked, smiling as she reached him. He took her hand and led her to a bench they'd sat on dozens of times. It overlooked a small pond with a fountain, surrounded by trees and flower beds that Elena had designed. She'd created a peaceful little oasis in the middle of the busy city. "Look at the bench," he said. She looked down at the wooden backrest. Freshly carved into it, the letters still clean and bright were words. "This is where nothing else mattered." She read it, confusion crossing her face. "What is this?" "I had it done yesterday," he explained, his heart pounding. "I wanted to mark this spot because I've been thinking about that day, the conference. The moment you walked across that room. She waited, sensing he had more to say. In that moment, everything else in my life became background noise. My careful plans, my safe choices, my comfortable routine, none of it mattered anymore. You were all I could see, all I wanted to see. He took a breath and got down on one knee. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. For 1.5 years, you've been teaching me what it means to really live. Not just exist, not just go through the motions, but actually live. You've challenged me to be brave, to dream bigger, to take risks. You've shown me that roots aren't chains, that commitment isn't giving up freedom. He pulled out a small box from his pocket. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. I know you're still learning to trust this. To trust us. I know you still sometimes wake up scared that you've given up too much, stayed too long. But I'm asking you to keep trusting. Keep choosing us. Keep choosing this life we're building together. Elena, he said, his voice thick with emotion, will you marry me? Tears streamed down her face. She tried to speak but couldn't get words out. She just nodded, laughing and crying at the same time. Is that a yes? He asked, wanting to hear her say it. Yes, she managed. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring on her finger and she pulled him up into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. Around them, a few people in the park had noticed and started clapping. Someone whistled. Someone else called out congratulations. But he barely heard them. In that moment, just like that first moment when she'd walked toward him across the conference room, nothing else mattered. The world could have been ending and he wouldn't have noticed. He was exactly where he needed to be. They got married 8 months later. A small ceremony in the same park, surrounded by family and friends from across the world. Her father, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years, flew in from overseas. His parents, who'd worried about him during the breakup, couldn't stop smiling through the entire ceremony. Elena wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers. He wore a suit that felt too formal but that she'd insisted made him look handsome. They wrote their own vows, promised to keep choosing each other even when it was hard, to keep being brave together, to keep building their life one day at a time. The party afterward was casual. Good food, good wine, people dancing on the grass. His friend made a toast about how he'd never seen him happier. Her colleague from work gave a speech about how Elena had finally found her home. Years passed. They bought a house, a small fixer-upper that they renovated together. She got promoted to director of urban planning. He started his own sustainable design firm, taking the leap he'd been afraid to take before. They had a daughter 3 years after the wedding, a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's curiosity. They brought her to the park often, to the bench with the carved words. One afternoon, when their daughter was about 5, she ran her fingers over the engraving and asked, "Daddy, what does this mean? Nothing else mattered?" He looked at Elena, who sat beside him on the bench, their daughter between them. She smiled, and he knew she was remembering the same thing he was. That conference room. Those steps across the floor. That moment when everything changed. "It means," Elena said, picking up their daughter and settling her on her lap, "that sometimes life gives you a moment that changes everything. And you have to be brave enough to recognize it. Brave enough to let it change you." "Like when you met Daddy?" their daughter asked. "Exactly like that," he said. "Your mom walked across a room and suddenly nothing else seemed as important as getting to know her." Their daughter thought about this seriously. But other things are important, like family and being kind and taking care of the earth. "You're absolutely right," Elena said, kissing the top of her head. "Those things are important. But sometimes one moment, one person, one choice can set everything else in motion, can lead you to all the other important things." They sat on that bench as the sun set, their daughter between them watching the fountain in the pond. Other people passed by on the path. Joggers, couples holding hands, families with dogs. Life continuing around them in all its messy, beautiful complexity. He thought about the man he'd been 18 months before that conference. Playing it safe, going through the motions, afraid to want more because wanting more meant risking what he had. Now he'd learned that the real risk wasn't in wanting more. The real risk was in settling for less than what made him truly alive. The real risk was in letting fear keep him from taking those steps toward something real. Their daughter fell asleep against Elena's shoulder, tired from playing in the park. They stayed a little longer, not ready to break the peace of the moment. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked Elena quietly. "Giving up the traveling? The flexibility?" She was quiet for a moment and he wondered if he shouldn't have asked. But then she said, I don't think I gave it up. I think I traded it for something better. Different adventures, deeper roots. A life I can look at and say, I built this. That feels more satisfying than always moving on to the next temporary thing. No regrets then? One regret, she said, and his heart skipped. I regret not talking to you first that day at the conference, making you do all the nervous approaching. He laughed softly. I'm glad I did it. Gave me a good story for our daughter when she's older and asking about how we met. They eventually headed home, Elena carrying their sleeping daughter, him carrying the bag with her toys, walking through their neighborhood as the streetlights came on, greeting neighbors they'd gotten to know, feeling like they belonged somewhere. That night, after putting their daughter to bed, they sat on their back porch with tea. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was settling down for the night. Thank you, Elena said out of nowhere. For what? For being brave enough to approach me that day. For being patient when I was scared. For showing me that staying could be better than running. He took her hand. Thank you for walking into that conference room. For being someone worth changing my entire life for. They sat in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that only comes when you're with someone who knows you completely and loves you anyway. Inside the house, their daughter slept peacefully. Around them, the life they'd built together continued in 1,000 small ways. The plants Elena had chosen for the garden. The furniture they'd picked out together. The photos on the walls documenting their journey from that first coffee date to this moment. Nothing about their life was perfect. They still had disagreements. Still had stressful days and moments of doubt. Still had bills to pay and responsibilities to handle and challenges to face, but they faced them together. And that made all the difference. That first day when she walked toward him across the conference room, he couldn't have imagined all of this. The life they'd build, the love they'd share, the family they'd create. But in that moment when their eyes met and nothing else seemed to matter, some part of him must have known. Some part of him recognized that these steps she was taking, these simple movements across a crowded room, were carrying something extraordinary toward him, and he'd been brave enough to receive it. That was their real story. Not a fairy tale. Not perfect, just real. Two people who found each other in a moment of courage and built a life together, one brave choice at a time. And every single step had been worth it.